our Zeitgeist project, we chose 1973. So 1973. So what makes this year important? Well, a lot of landmark decisions happened this year. Number one, we get the legalization of abortion. We also have the removal of U.S. troops from Vietnam, Watergate, and there's also the very influential 10th match of the ballot sexes.
So on January 22nd, 1973, abortion was legalized in the Roe v. Wade case, and this started with Norma McCorvey, who had previously gotten 2 illegal abortions, but decided that she needed another one, but she took it to court, and eventually abortion was legalized. And in the years before, abortion had been illegal and it was dangerous, and many women died while getting them. And after the legalization, the maternal mortality rate dropped 45%, and it was proven that getting an abortion is 7 times safer than actually carrying a baby. And then, unfortunately, in 2022, abortion was criminalized again, and we are now dealing with the consequences of that.
This was also the year when America took troops out of Vietnam. So first, we're just going to give a little bit of background on the Vietnam War. It started after World War II, when Vietnam was kind of in a state of disarray. It was controlled by a capitalist and more westernized leader, but in the north, a political figure named Ho Chi Minh wanted to utilize the ideas of communism in the country. So he started a civil war, and he was in North Vietnam, and the U.S. supported South Vietnam, the more western one. Then Russia, the USSR, also got involved with this war, making it a very big proxy war, one of the largest we've seen. So then we have had this war going on for more than a decade now. And Richard Nixon wanted troops to get out. He wanted, it was going on, people were starting to realize that the U.S. was doing some naughty things there. So what did we do? Well, he started this thing called Vietnamization. It was basically this thing where Nixon slowly withdrew the U.S. troops and provided more arms to the South Vietnamese troops. And it was kind of controversial. He didn't do it very well. And what happened was that many South Vietnamese soldiers died. However, the Vietnam War did end 2 years later in 1975.
So this is the picture of the evacuation in Saigon, which was in 1975. And so U.S. forces evacuated thousands of Americans and South Vietnamese from Saigon, which is now known as Ho Chi Minh City. The U.S. had already withdrawn forces in Vietnam in 1973, but still 5,000 Americans remained. And this was only a few days before Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese army, which ended the war.
The Watergate scandal. A couple years prior to 1973, the Nixon administration and men under it committed some crimes. These were only discovered until late 1972. One of these crimes, the biggest one, was a burglary in the Watergate complex, these group of office buildings next to the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. Basically what happened was that some people snuck in, broke in, and it was the Democratic National Committee's headquarters. And what happened here is that they took some evidence, they tapped some phones, and it was found out by, I think it was a janitor, someone working in the building. And this was all covered up, a lot of covering up, and it was only a couple months later when the Washington Post found out and started breaking the news. This was a huge scandal. It was the biggest one in the 1900s, and Nixon resigned a year later, and his vice president resigned in 1973.
The end of the space race. It was between the USA and the Soviet Union. 2 years before, Neil Armstrong was the first man on the moon. And 2 years after the end of the space race, Skylab was created. And a few years after it was created, it fell down to Earth, and it was America's first space station.
So the American Indian Movement, which is known as AIM, it was founded in Minneapolis, and it was made because in the first half of the 20th century, police were performing acts of police brutality and racial profiling, and the police were trying to control many Native American lands and with intentions of breaking up the tribes and making those tribes move to American cities. So in 1953, the determination policy made, which ended the recognition of over 100 tribes. So some notable protests of this organization is Thanksgiving 1970. Members of AIM seized a replica of the Mayflower in Boston Harbor. Occupation of Mount Rushmore. This lasted for 2 months, and activists camped on Mount Rushmore, which was once a sacred spot for local tribes, but is now the mountain with the founding fathers. So in Wounded Knee, 200 people occupied Wounded Knee, which was the site of an 1890 massacre, and many people died. There were standoffs. It was a very big deal for this organization. But then in 1975, Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, which provided recognition and funds to Native American tribes.
American affairs. So many internal affairs were happening in America during this time. One of the biggest was the 25th Amendment, or I was actually the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age to 18. This was a huge thing. It was a part of like American progress and liberalization that occurred during this time. This was part of these 3 amendments that happened around this area. There was also the presidential death one that came after JFK died, and the 24th Amendment. These were all pretty big. Now, you also have the first handheld phone call, which was, I mean, look at how we use phones today. It was a pretty big thing, and not too much press at the time, but it became pretty large. The World Trade Center also opened in this year. It had been built for many years prior, and its unveiling was like a big day for economics in New York City. There's also some landmark cultural stuff, such as the first 2 women of color were nominated for Best Actress in the Oscars, and the Ballot and Sexy tennis match in which Billie Jean King defeated Bobby Riggs. King beat Riggs 6-4, 6-3, 6-3, and this was a pretty big thing in women's rights, and I mean, you have the abortion getting legalized the same year. Women are getting like recognized more. And here are some pictures. We see the first handheld phones. These are obviously not the original ones. About sexes, The Godfather. This is Skylab number 2. There are 3 Skylabs. They were all launched in space as an early space program. The voting age being lowered. That's some protests before it happened. And we also have the 2 actresses. International shifts. A lot was going outside the country that we haven't touched on. There was the Munich massacre in 1972. This was when an Israeli Olympic team was attacked by a group of Palestinian terrorists known as Black September. This was in protest to the Yom Kippur War. And then later we also have the 1973 oil crisis, also related. It was when Arab nations made an embargo on U.S. oil, and oil quickly rose the prices. The Vietnam War also ended, as we touched on earlier. Similarly, the U.S. bombing of Cambodia ended, and this was a big thing. Cambodia was part of the Vietnam War, but it was often not seen as like holding hostiles. However, the U.S. often carpet bombed it, but they stopped it in 1973. And détente with USSR. This was similar to the Vietnamization. This is when Nixon decided to get a little friendlier with the USSR and attempts to ease the Cold War. By doing this, he met with Khrushchev not Khrushchev, but he met with their leader, and he got a little bit friendlier until the war in Afghanistan later. And here's a little graphic to the price of oil in 1973. It rose a lot, 300%.
So just some fun facts about 1973. As we mentioned before, The Godfather won Best Picture, and is now known as one of the best American films ever. So also Jaws came out in 1975, which is obviously one of the best known movies, and it broke box office records and is known as the first summer blockbuster. In 1974, the Sears Tower became the world's tallest building, but that only lasted for 1 year. And in 1971, the Walt Disney theme park in Florida opened.
So here are some common themes of 1973. We see the Watergate scandal, as touched upon earlier. In the early 1970s, Richard Nixon's administration committed some crimes. This was initially not covered in the news very much, grew to a huge story. He resigned. We have detente. The U.S. and USSR had increasing tensions during the 60s, but cooled down a little bit in 1973 before rising again in the Afghanistan War.
So, women's rights is a big theme for this year, which started when abortion was legalized in early 1973, and we see it move on with the 2 women of color being nominated, as well as the Battle of the Sexes, and just it was a big year for women.
Progress during the 1970s, many progressive decisions were made, like voting and women's rights, including Roe v. Wade, and new technologies and companies were formed.
And your other source